But the most fascinating and gentle story is that of the scriptorium. The monks, even as they died, made desperate attempts to preserve their knowledge. They would often seal up their library or hastily pack their most precious manuscripts, hoping that future generations would find them intact. This was the ultimate monastic act, prioritizing the survival of knowledge in scripture over their own comfort. A tiny, fragile light of intellectual discipline trying to survive the darkness. The Black Death gutted the monastic orders. It destroyed the order, the discipline, and the manpower base of the church's most powerful institution. When the plague finally receded, the new monks who came in to fill the gaps were often less educated, less disciplined, and generally less prepared for the life. The rigorous, highly intellectual life of the early medieval monastery was gone, replaced by a much simpler, often coarser form of devotion. It was a quiet catastrophe, one that reminds us that even the most meticulously ordered human systems are powerless against a biological reality. The bells stopped ringing, and the silence that followed was the sound of a spiritual world turned upside down. Let's gently return now to the world of imperial etiquette and the peculiar personal habits of the Roman emperors. Part 10. The strange diet and digestive woes of Claudius. We're going to settle into a fascinating, slightly sad corner of Roman history, the life of Emperor Claudius, 10 BCE to AD 54. He was an academic, a scholar, and a historian who was utterly dismissed by his own family. He was a stuttering, limping, socially awkward man who was only made emperor because he was the last man standing after the Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula. It was a classic, oops, who's left moment in Roman politics. His life before the throne was spent as the family eccentric, the quiet academic who was mocked for his physical infirmities. But when he became emperor, he proved to be a surprisingly capable, if sometimes brutal, administrator. His reign saw the successful conquest of Britain, which was, naturally, a big deal. But we are interested in his peculiar personal habits, and Claudius was an emperor with a strange consuming passion, food. He was a notorious, unapologetic glutton. Dining in imperial Rome was a complicated affair, a mix of lavish spectacle and social maneuvering. For Claudius, it was a constant, all-consuming mission. He was known to never leave a meal until he was absolutely physically full, regardless of how long it took or how uncomfortable it made him. The problem with being a Roman emperor and a glutton is that your diet is spectacularly rich. We're talking about dormice dipped in honey, vast quantities of rich sauces, and entire roasted boars, and a dizzying variety of exotic bird tongues and fish. All of this was washed down with copious amounts of wine. Claudius had two habits related to this gluttony that were, naturally, quite unbecoming for an emperor. Firstly, he was often seen wandering the city completely incognito and dining in common taverns. While the imperial kitchen could produce anything he desired, he seemed to enjoy the simple, rowdy atmosphere of the common eating establishments, where he could eat without the crippling etiquette of the palace. It's a nice image, the stuttering, limping emperor surrounded by boisterous commoners enjoying a plate of simple beans and cheap wine. And secondly, and far more unfortunately for those around him, his immense appetite led to inevitable, dramatic digestive issues. Ancient sources record that Claudius was known for the constant public emission of flatulence. Now, this was a matter of etiquette in ancient Rome. It was generally considered polite to relieve oneself discreetly when the urge struck. But an emperor constantly doing this during feasts and official functions, that was another matter. Claudius, in his typical pragmatic way, decided to eliminate the social awkwardness with an official decree. He was so plagued by his own digestive system that he reportedly issued an edict making it legal for anyone to pass gas in his presence at any time in order to prevent death from trying to hold it in. Imagine the scene at the imperial dining table. Courtiers are carefully discussing foreign policy, the latest triumphs in Britain, or the intricacies of Roman law, all while the emperor, and now officially everyone else, is audibly dealing with the consequences of too much roast boar and honey. It's almost a perfect illustration of how the personal eccentricities of an absolute ruler can become codified into law. This digestive preoccupation was, sadly, a factor in his death. Claudius was notoriously clumsy in love as he was at the dinner table. His wife, Agrippina the Younger, had him poisoned as she was keen to get her own son Nero onto the throne. The method chosen was, naturally, a plate of poisoned mushrooms. The story goes that the poison didn't work immediately, or it was a slow-acting dose. Claudius, ever the glutton, managed to eat so much that the initial dose didn't kill him. The plotters, in a panic, called in his doctor, who, under Agrippina's instruction, finished the job by forcing a poisoned feather down his throat, ostensibly to make him vomit. Claudius, the clumsy scholar, the gluttonous emperor, died not by a sword or a dagger, but by a combination of his own immense appetite and a hasty, poorly executed palace coup. He had spent his life dealing with his digestive issues, only for his final meal to be the thing that killed him. A sad, ironic end to a strange, academically inclined man who simply wanted a quiet dinner without having to worry about offending anyone with his gaseous emissions. And now we'll let Claudius and his unfortunate digestive habits fade into the twilight. Part 11. The Misguided Majesty of Emperor Caligula's Horse. We're drifting back just a little bit to Claudius's immediate predecessor, the man he was hiding from when he became emperor, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula. Caligula is the absolute archetype of the mad, spoiled, and deeply sadistic Roman emperor. His 3.5-year reign was a whirlwind of excess, cruelty, and naturally, one very famous horse. The story of Caligula's horse in Cetus is one of the great, enduring tales of imperial Roman excess and insanity. The emperor reportedly loved this horse with his singular passion, a love that far eclipsed his feelings for his human subjects. Cetus was a racehorse, a champion of the emperor's personal stable. But Caligula decided that a mere horse was not a fit position for such a magnificent creature. He began treating the animal with the pomp and ceremony usually reserved for a high-ranking senator or a consul. The horse was given marble stables. His manger was carved from ivory, an immense extravagance. He was given purple blankets, the imperial color, which was usually reserved solely for the emperor himself. His bridle was reportedly adorned with precious stones, diamonds, and pearls. The horse lived in a state of luxury that surpassed most senators, because, of course, he did. Then came the social elevation. Caligula would host banquets and invite Cetus to attend. The horse would be led to the dining room, where servants, terrified of the emperor's temper, would present the animal with wine and a bizarre selection of human food. The horse was a dinner guest, an absurd, silent presence at the heart of Roman power. Caligula would often spend hours talking to the horse, sharing his innermost secrets and desires. The horse was, presumably, a much better listener than the terrified, sycophantic senators who surrounded him. But the story reaches its pinnacle with the emperor's final, grand, and entirely insane plan. Caligula intended to appoint Cetus as a consul. The consulship was the highest elected political office in the Roman Republic, and later one of the most prestigious positions in the empire. It was the symbol of Roman civic life and tradition, and Caligula decided to give it to a horse. Now, historians debate whether Caligula actually intended to go through with this. Some suggest it was the ultimate black humor prank, a way for Caligula to demonstrate his absolute contempt for the Roman Senate. He was essentially telling the greatest men in Rome, "You are all so worthless, I could replace any of you with my horse, and the empire would run just as well." A sardonic point, perhaps, but one made with immense theatrical cruelty. Others believe he was genuinely clinically mad and fully intended to elevate his horse to the highest office. In either case, the entire court had to treat the possibility seriously. They had to talk about Encetus's potential qualifications, his fitness for office, and the appropriate ceremonial regalia for a consul horse. Imagine the meetings, the hushed, terrified discussions among the leading men of the empire. Your Excellency, perhaps the horse would prefer a red silk toga, not purple. It's a perfect image of absolute power forcing a sophisticated political class to descend into the utter ridiculous farce. The reign of Caligula ended, as these things often do, with a violent, bloody assassination orchestrated by his own Praetorian Guard and elements of the Senate. He was only 29 years old. The fate of Encetus is somewhat debated, but the most gentle version of the story suggests that after Caligula's death, the new emperor, Claudius, who we just discussed, allowed the horse to live out its retirement in comfort, though he did
was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth did not meet. He couldn't chew his food properly, which contributed to his chronic digestive issues. He was often described as resembling a tired, poorly made puppet. If you were to trace his family tree, you'd find more circles than lines. His parents were Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Philip was Mariana's uncle. The family's coefficient of inbreeding, a scientific measure of how related the parents are, was astonishingly high. It has been calculated that Charles II had a coefficient of 0.254. To put that in perspective, marrying a sibling produces a coefficient of 0.25. Charles II was, genetically speaking, more inbred than the child of a brother-sister union. Because, of course, he was. His existence was a daily struggle. He was prone to fits, hallucinations, and chronic pain. The palace itself became an echo chamber of his suffering. But he was the king of Spain, and so the machinery of the empire had to grind on, even while its chief mechanic was barely able to lift a spoon. His court was a strange mixture of immense wealth and desperate superstition. Since the doctors couldn't fix him, and naturally, they made it worse with bloodletting and toxic mercury-based remedies, they turned to the spiritual. Charles was convinced, and the court believed, that he was the victim of sorcery. He was not merely sick, he was bewitched. Priests and exorcists were brought in. They performed elaborate, lengthy rituals to cast out the demons they believed were inhabiting the frail king. They even went so far as to exhuming the bodies of previous long-dead monarchs to check for signs of satanic interference. Imagine being the king, suffering from chronic pain, and having a priest whisper Latin incantations over you while the court debates which ancestor to dig up next. It's certainly a unique way to run an empire. Poor Charles II tried to fulfill his dynastic duty. He married twice. Both marriages were political arrangements designed to produce an heir and continue the Habsburg line. Neither marriage produced a single living child. He was tragically infertile, perhaps the final, most merciful act of nature regarding his bloodline. He died childless in 1700 at the age of 38, ending the Spanish Habsburg dynasty and immediately triggering the devastating War of the Spanish Succession. A fragile, sickly king who could barely chew his food ended up plunging Europe into over a decade of brutal, widespread conflict. All because his ancestors valued territory more than genetic diversity. It's an ironically potent illustration of how the personal fate of a sickly royal could become the geopolitical fate of millions. Let's gently move our focus now away from the grand inbred tragedy of the Habsburgs and towards the smaller, pettier, but equally fascinating meltdowns of a different set of monarchs. Part 3. The very petty meltdowns of royal egotists. We settle in now to an atmosphere of slight awkwardness and simmering resentment. Forget the grand strategy of empires. We are now concerned with the strange habits and deeply unfortunate personal choices of monarchs who, having been granted absolute power, chose to use that power for intensely petty reasons. The life of a ruler, even an absolute one, was a life of unending routine and suffocating ceremony. It was a life where everyone had to agree with you, constantly. This tends to breed a peculiar brand of egotism, a belief that your every whim, no matter how ridiculous, is of paramount importance to the state. Naturally, they made life worse for everyone around them. Let's start our low-energy exploration in the 18th century with a man who was almost a caricature of an enlightened despot, Frederick William I of Prussia. He was the father of Frederick the Great, and he was known as the Soldier King. He was utterly obsessed with the military. He cared nothing for art, philosophy, or the comforts of the palace. He wanted a perfect army, and he wanted tall men. This obsession manifested in a unit known as the Potsdam Giants, or the Longfellows. This was his personal regiment, composed entirely of men who were giants by 18th century standards. Most were well over 6 feet tall, some even reaching 7 feet. They were his prized possessions, and their uniform was magnificent, designed to accentuate their height. Now, an army needs good soldiers, but Frederick William I needed his long carols more than anything. He would spend astronomical amounts of state money to recruit these men from all over Europe, often through methods that were less than ethical. Sometimes they were simply kidnapped, pressed into service against their will, and forced to parade for the king's viewing pleasure because, naturally, he didn't care about their personal feelings. He cared about their height. The king's relationship with his giants was deeply peculiar. They were not merely soldiers, they were pets. He would weep when one died. He had portraits painted of them. His greatest joy was to watch them parade, sometimes several times a day, in excruciatingly repetitive drills. When his mood was foul, he would use them as a means of punishment. He would beat them with his cane if they failed to meet his exacting standards of straightness or discipline. But the real petty meltdown came when the king was feeling ill or depressed. He would order his giants, his biggest, most prized possessions, to be brought into his bedroom. He didn't want them to perform drills. He just wanted to stare at them while he rested. Imagine being a 7-foot-tall man, a foreign mercenary who was perhaps kidnapped from his home, now standing motionless in the dim, stale bedroom of an irritable, sickly king, simply so the monarch could admire your stature. It's an astonishing display of absolute power channeled into personal, aesthetic preference. He was a man who preferred a simple, militaristic life. He was notoriously cheap, obsessively controlling, and violently temperamental. He once decreed that anyone who showed any fear of smallpox would be publicly flogged. He beat his courtiers, his servants, and most famously his own son, the future Frederick the Great, whom he despised for preferring French poetry and flute playing to drilling soldiers. The king was so opposed to his son's intellectual pursuits that he once physically attacked him in public and later had his best friend executed in front of him for aiding the prince's attempted escape. A truly gentle, encouraging father. Let's drift over to a slightly wetter, colder kingdom for our next example of low-grade and royal tyranny. Sweden. We'll meet King Gustav IV Adolf, a man whose brief reign ended in confusion, delusion, and a surprisingly dramatic coup. King Gustav IV Adolf, late 18th and early 19th century, was a deeply conservative, religiously devout king and pathologically suspicious. He saw himself as a divine warrior, a crusader against the evils of the French Revolution, and particularly against the perceived Antichrist, Napoleon Bonaparte. His major meltdown was not personal or physical, but geopolitical and ideological. He absolutely fervently hated Napoleon. This was not a nuanced political position, it was a personal, venomous vendetta. He called Napoleon the beast of the apocalypse. He refused to deal with any French ambassador, and he wouldn't even open letters that contained the phrase Emperor Napoleon, which naturally made diplomacy difficult. He acted as though the French leader was simply a low-grade demonic presence that could be wished away. This hatred led him to some spectacularly misguided royal decisions. While the rest of Europe was cautiously trying to find a path through the Napoleonic Wars, Gustav IV threw Sweden headfirst into a conflict with France and Russia purely out of moral outrage. He was so consumed by his divine mission that he utterly ignored the reality of Sweden's limited military strength. The result was predictable: disaster. Sweden was invaded by Russia and they lost Finland, a major, centuries-old Swedish possession, in a humiliating defeat. But even as the country bled in lost territory, Gustav IV maintained his bizarre, delusional routine. He would meticulously plan military campaigns on maps, convinced that God would grant him victory if he was pure enough. His court descended into a state of paralysis, dominated by the king's rigid piety and strategic incompetence. Finally, in 1809, the nobility and the military had enough. They staged a quiet, deeply Swedish coup d'etat. The king was arrested by his own officers with minimal fuss and promptly imprisoned.
Gustav IV Adolf spent the rest of his life wandering Europe, living under various aliases, sometimes working as a tutor, sometimes as a minor nobleman, always nursing his profound, unshakable belief that he had been the victim of a satanic conspiracy. The man who had once believed he was destined to defeat Napoleon died quietly in Switzerland, a forgotten, exiled eccentric. A final, pathetic illustration of an unearned and misplaced royal ego. We move gently now back to the continent to explore the often ignored, frankly terrifying world of medieval royal childhoods. Part 4. Fragile Children and Farcical Rituals. We are now drifting back in time, sinking into the cold, drafty stone halls of the medieval castle. We'll examine the period where the concentration of political power met the fragility of human life, the childhood of the medieval royal heir. It was a time of strange medical practices, constant danger, and a bewildering amount of ceremony for a child who often wouldn't live past the age of 5. The statistics were brutal. If you were a child born into a royal house in the 12th or 13th centuries, your chances of surviving to adulthood were barely better than those of a commoner. Plague, infection, simple fevers, they cut down princes and princesses with a chilling, democratic regularity. Yet the entire machinery of the kingdom revolved around the hope that this one small, vulnerable child would survive. The resulting atmosphere was one of intense, suffocating anxiety masked by layers of pomp. Let's look at the early life of a typical Plantagenet prince, perhaps one of the many sons of King Edward I. The moment he was born, the countdown to his fragile existence began, accompanied by ridiculous pageantry. A royal birth was not a private affair. The queen would be surrounded by witnesses, noblemen, bishops, and midwives, all there to guarantee that the child was indeed the queen's and that it was not switched or a changeling or some other medieval paranoia. The child would be immediately examined for marks, signs, or any deformity that might be taken as an ill omen. Then came the nurses. Royal mothers often did not breastfeed their own children. It was considered socially unacceptable, a waste of a queen's time, and the demands of court life made it impractical. A wet nurse was employed, a woman chosen not just for her health but for her temperament. It was believed that the emotional state and personality of the wet nurse would pass to the child through her milk. So they would seek a woman who was calm, morally upright, and naturally well-formed. A significant amount of statecraft was devoted to finding a woman with excellent maternal qualities and the proper breast shape, because, of course. The young prince or princess was swaddled tightly, often to the point of immobility, a practice believed to encourage straight limbs, but which was likely deeply uncomfortable and unsanitary. They were cared for by a small army of servants, nurses, rockers, washers, and watchmen. A child's simple cold could throw the court into a panic. Now let's address the farcical rituals. As soon as the child was out of infancy, the education began, often far too early and far too harshly. The heir to the throne wasn't just a child, he was a living symbol, and he needed to learn the language of power, which was often Latin, warfare, and theology. The poor child was often assigned a governor, a stern, elderly nobleman whose primary task was to instill piety, discipline, and a profound sense of self-importance. Punishments were common, even for the most high-ranking children. The principle was that to rule others, one must first learn to rule oneself, often via the application of a thin birch rod. Imagine being 8 years old, spending your entire day practicing calligraphy, memorizing Latin scripture, and training with wooden swords, all while suffering from chronic digestive issues brought on by a monotonous diet and the lack of basic sanitation. And all this pressure was applied to a child who had a 50% chance of dying before they reached double digits. The most tragic figures in this system are the princes who were destined for greatness but were simply too frail. Consider the sons of Henry II of England. His sons were known for their vicious infighting and rebellion. Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John. But Henry II also had a number of boys who simply faded away in infancy or childhood. We forget the constant cycle of childbirth, hope, and agonizing loss that defined royal life. A princess, having barely survived infancy, would be married off as a strategic pawn by the age of 12 or 13, often to a man 3 times her age. She was expected to produce an heir immediately, putting her own delicate young body at extreme risk. The life of a medieval royal was a bewildering contradiction, a life of immense privilege combined with perpetual danger. Surrounded by wealth and ceremony, they were nonetheless vulnerable to any passing sneeze or bad batch of food. The most powerful people in the kingdom were often utterly powerless against the smallest microbe. The whole system was a display of fragile vanity. Kings would spend fortunes on jeweled christening robes and elaborate tapestries for a nursery, while simultaneously ignoring the basic principles of hygiene. The heir was taught to be a warrior or a statesman while being completely shielded from the world of genuine practicality and common sense. It's a testament to the sheer luck of the draw that any of them survived to rule at all. Now let's gently float away from the cold nurseries and examine the strange, dark corners of Roman daily routine once more. Part 5. The peculiar habits of Roman cave dwellers, the urban kind. We're going to glide back to the Roman Empire, but this time we're not focused on the laundresses or the generals. We're going to explore the daily lives of the vast majority of the city's population, the insulae, the Roman apartment blocks. When you think of Roman life, you imagine the sweeping villas, the baths, the mosaics, but those were for the tiny elite. Over 90% of a city like Rome lived in high-density, multi-story tenements, the insulae. The name itself means island, and they truly were islands of humanity, packed tightly together in towering structures that were naturally prone to collapse and fire. The story of the Roman commoner is essentially, what did they actually do all day to avoid dying in a pile of rubble or burning to death? And the answer is they spent very little time indoors. Imagine the typical insula. It could be 6 or 7 stories high, built with questionable materials, often wood, mortar, and mud bricks. The ground floor was typically reserved for shops, tabernae, which rented for high prices due to their commercial value. The floors above housed the poor. The higher you went, the cheaper and more dangerous the apartment became. The elite liked to mock the poor for living so high up. The poet Juvenal wrote with typical Roman sarcasm about the terror of living on the 6th floor, where a falling roof tile or the collapse of the entire structure was a constant daily threat. Life in the upper floors was simple, communal, and uncomfortable. There was no running water. Water had to be hauled up from the public fountains in the streets below. There was no internal kitchen. Open flames were usually banned due to the constant threat of fire, so the vast majority of Romans did not cook at home. This led to the unique Roman phenomenon of the thermopolia, the ancient Roman fast food joint. This was where the common Roman actually spent most of their waking day. The Thermopolian was a bar or counter, often with large terracotta jars, dolia, embedded in the counter which kept food warm. You would buy hot, ready-made meals, stews, beans, chickpeas, flapbread, and, of course, a lot of cheap wine. This was the true room and living room. People stood outside, ate quickly, and socialized. It was a loud, bustling, and often chaotic scene. The other major daily issue was, naturally, sanitation. The wealthy had latrines and basic plumbing in their villas, which emptied into the city's amazing sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima. The people in the insulae did not. They had chamber pots, and those chamber pots had to be emptied. The preferred, simplest, and most efficient method for the resident of the 4th floor was to simply throw the contents out the window and into the narrow, crowded alley below. This was such a common practice that Roman law actually had specific clauses dealing with injuries caused by the contents of a chamber pot being thrown out a window. If you were hit by water, a polite term for human waste, you could sue for damages. Imagine the court case. "My lord, the slop from the 6th floor shoemaker has ruined my new tunic." It's a fascinating, if disgusting, insight into the daily risks of a Roman pedestrian. So the daily schedule of the urban Roman commoner looked something like this. Wake up in a small, damp, crowded room with no privacy. Dispose of waste, hopefully carefully, but often directly out the window. Head to the forum or work for manual labor or to their tiny shop, often located downstairs. The bath. The public baths, the thermae, were the true centers of hygiene, health, and socialization. They were cheap or even free and essential to Roman life. They would spend hours there, not just washing, but exercising, gossiping, and conducting business. Eat at the Thermopolia, standing up, enjoying a cheap bowl of something hot. Sleep back to the cramped, noisy, and fire-prone upper floor, hoping the structure lasted the night.
This was the life of the vast majority of the people who made the empire run. A life defined by poor housing, great social interaction, and a lot of creative waste disposal. They were the cave dwellers of the urban jungle, living vertically in structures that defied gravity until they inevitably didn't. It reminds us that history is not just about the gilded palaces, but about the struggle of people trying to live with basic dignity in the face of structural incompetence and ancient municipal challenges. Let's now gently pivot back to the royal melodramas of Europe, where the problems were often self-inflicted. Part 6. The unfortunate reign of the confused turnip. We're settling into the low, foggy atmosphere of the early medieval period in France, a time known as the Capetian dynasty. This era, roughly 10th to 14th century, was a parade of mostly forgettable kings with magnificent and usually undeserved nicknames. We're going to focus on a man whose reign was a perfect blend of high-sounding titles and deeply unfortunate reality. Louis VI of France, nicknamed the Fat. Now, a name like the Fat doesn't exactly conjure images of heroic, dashing kingship, but it's ironically gentle compared to some of the others. Louis VI, 1081 to 1137, was a surprisingly good king in many ways. He consolidated royal power, fought diligently against rebellious barons, and was a close friend and patron of the brilliant abbot Suger of Saint-Denis. But we are here to explore the ironic contrasts and personal misfortunes of the elite, and Louis VI had a magnificent physical irony attached to his name. The term fat in this context didn't just mean overweight, it meant large, sluggish, and physically incapable in his later years. Louis VI started life as a vibrant, active prince. He loved hunting and warfare, he was robust and energetic, he was everything a medieval king needed to be, muscular and decisive. Then life and luxury took their toll. As he aged and his diet of rich hunted game and heavy wine did its work, he became increasingly corpulent. This was viewed as a sign of prosperity initially, but it quickly became debilitating. By the time he was in his 40s, his obesity had turned him into a suffering recluse. His once magnificent physique had betrayed him. He could barely mount a horse, which for a medieval monarch who needed to constantly campaign and ride across his domain was a crippling liability. The King of France, the supreme feudal overlord, was essentially confined to his bedchamber or carried around in a litter, a massive human-powered sedan chair. Imagine the absurdity of commanding an army, directing the affairs of state, and meeting foreign ambassadors, all while being permanently winded and carried everywhere by 4 sweating servants. The nickname the Fat thus went from a slightly endearing description to a sad commentary on his lost vigor. His reign, which started with military energy, ended in a kind of logistical nightmare, where every movement was a painful, highly coordinated effort. This is where the sardonic contrast comes in. Louis VI was also sometimes called Louis the Fair, or Le Gros, the Great, by his more flattering chroniclers. A man nicknamed the Fair and the Great, whose most enduring characteristic, the one history has preserved with the most clinical accuracy, is that he was so large he could barely walk. He was a living paradox, a powerful king whose sheer physical bulk reduced his power to move, resembling a mildly confused turnip confined to a small plot of land, his palace. His greatest personal obsession in his later, immobile years was religion and dynastic security. Being large, he was constantly concerned with his health, and he poured immense energy into securing the succession. He did everything he could to ensure his son, the future Louis VII, was strong, pious, and crucially, not as large as he was. This brings us to his most significant but entirely accidental decision, the marriage of his son to Eleanor of Aquitaine. To secure the immense Duchy of Aquitaine, the most powerful woman in Europe, for his son was his final brilliant logistical maneuver. He secured the greatest territory in France for the crown. He died shortly after the wedding, leaving his son, Louis VII, to inherit both the throne and the fiery, independent-minded Eleanor. Louis VII, unfortunately, was pious, ascetic, and rather meek, the opposite of his vigorous, if now immobile, father. The marriage was a spectacular failure, ending in annulment and Eleanor taking her immense lands to marry the King of England, Henry II, plunging France and England into centuries of conflict. So, the legacy of Louis VI, the Fat, is a curious mix. A successful king who consolidated the crown's power, but who was tragically betrayed by his own appetite. And his greatest success, the marriage to Eleanor, turned into France's greatest territorial nightmare. A quiet irony that perfectly captures the unpredictable and often self-defeating nature of dynastic politics. Let's now move on to a different, much later dynasty, where the pettiness reached a truly remarkable, dramatic level. Part 7. The unbearable heaviness of being a German prince. We are now floating into the 18th century, into the sprawling, often ridiculous patchwork quilt of the Holy Roman Empire, a territory that was neither holy, nor Roman, nor much of an empire by this point. We are focused on the dozens of minor German princelings, the dukes, electors, and margraves, who held absolute power over tiny, insignificant territories and acted as though they were successors to Caesar. The life of a German prince in this era was defined by a peculiar sense of unearned vanity. They had inherited absolute power over a few villages, a modest castle, and perhaps an annual income equivalent to that of a very successful London merchant. and yet they insisted on maintaining the full, ludicrous panoply of a major European court. This required naturally immense amounts of pointless expenditure and petty tyranny over their unfortunate few thousand subjects. Let's meet a perfect example of this small-scale absurdity. Charles Eugene, Duke of Württemberg, 1728 to 1793. He was, by all accounts, a man of exceptional, self-destructive vanity. He saw himself as the German Louis XIV, a sun king ruling over a territory smaller than modern Delaware. His life was a dizzying, exhausting cycle of unnecessary projects and reckless spending. He decided, repeatedly, that his old palace wasn't grand enough and commissioned the building of several colossal new ones. The most famous was the Ludwigsburg Palace, a vast Baroque monstrosity that required immense tax levies to construct and maintain. He wasn't content with just a palace. He needed a fleet. Despite the fact that his duchy was entirely landlocked and hours from any major navigable river, he commissioned an entire fleet of ceremonial barges, complete with admirals and crew, who would float around on a small artificial lake that he had dug. The entire purpose was to allow the Duke to act like a naval commander in his landlocked bathtub of an empire. His greatest folly, however, was his court itself. He insisted on maintaining the same number of courtiers, servants, and minor officials as a major king like Frederick the Great, despite having a fraction of the income. The Duke needed an entire staff whose sole job was to look busy. He had a court jester, a court dwarf, an official slipper warmer, and dozens of useless, beautifully uniformed officers who spent their days standing around, waiting for the Duke to have a new idea. This was simply to impress other, equally small-time princes. It was an escalating arms race of vanity.